You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David Debato. Today, my very special guest is David Cay Johnston. David is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author. He's written many different books, some of them about Donald Trump, of which we're going to discuss some of them today. He's also written about a topic that I've talked about and written about quite a bit, which is the growing inequality gap here in America. A very serious topic. So we'll get into that. David is currently a professor at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And without further ado, again, I'm really glad to have David here. David, welcome to the No Delusion Zone.
Well, glad to be here.
Well, as I said off air, and it's obvious, we're going to talk about Donald Trump, oddly enough. MAGA, what happened during the election, and where we go from here. I have my own theories about why Trump won the election. So why don't we just get started with that? Why were so many, including, I have to say, yourself and me, so convinced that Kamala Harris would win and Donald Trump would lose, regardless of whether it was a landslide or not? He was going to lose. Obviously, we were all wrong. What happened?
Well, the biggest thing that happened is voter turnout fell very sharply. If there were 13 million fewer votes cast in 2024 than in 2020, and if you add population growth, there would have been 17 million more votes in 2024 if we kept the pace of 2020, which was a peak year for sure. Now, why did people stay home? Well, the biggest reason people stay home is they don't vote at all, but we're not talking about that group. We're talking about people who voted and then didn't vote. So there are a couple of answers to that. There was a drop off in votes when Obama ran for the second time. And to my absolute surprise, political scientists found Black voters in particular who had never voted before and then said, well, why would I vote again? I already voted to make him president, which tells you how poorly many people understand the election system. And every professor in America will tell you that the level of knowledge by students of the Constitution, how laws are made, history of the country has been declining sharply now for about 30 to 40 years. Next, when people who've been voting don't vote, that's usually a statement of, I'm happy with how things are. I don't want to change course. And that's probably going to turn out, when we have the full data, to be a very important factor. A lot of people just went, gee, things are fine. I mean, Donald went around telling people and persuading many of them that the US economy was a disaster. The Economist magazine in London, the most sober imaginable publication in the world on business and finance, did a cover story, America, the envy of the world. Our economy post-pandemic has so outperformed every other major country. The Biden added more jobs in his first 3 years in office, and most of that was after we recovered all the jobs we lost under Trump during the pandemic. More jobs than all the Republican presidents back to Eisenhower. And yet Trump kept saying there are no jobs, or persuading people that illegal immigrants took all the jobs, or they're all part-time jobs, as if we don't measure between full-time and part-time and salaried versus hourly. So a lot of people who I suspect felt they were doing pretty well just didn't vote. And let me give you one little metric on that. In 2023, the latest data we have, the median pay level, half make more, half make less. That's a median, the midpoint. And it's used as a typical number, much better than average, because if you have people making literally in this country billions of dollars of income each year, to talk about averages skews everything way high. Well, in 2023, the median rose 20% more than the average. That hasn't happened in decades. And what it tells you is that Bidenomics was increasing the incomes of people in the bottom half. And they were doing much better than anybody else. After years of the median going lower and lower and the spread between median and average growing, it suddenly shrank a little bit. But of course, most people don't follow statistics and they pay little attention. And I guess there's one other element. Journalism students at the Medill Journalism School north of Chicago at Northwestern University, they wrote a fascinating report showing that in counties with no newspaper, there are about 3,300 county or county equivalents in America, 3,300. And many of them no longer have a newspaper, not even a weekly newspaper. In those counties, Trump won with 80 to more than 90% of the vote. So what that tells you, in an environment where people don't have an objective source of news and all they get is Donald's propaganda, he does very well. And that's one of the reasons you're about to see him do everything he can to harass and suppress news gathering by honest news organizations, as opposed to the ones he likes that just make stuff up.
2017, Donald Trump. I love the poorly educated, and he does, and they love him too. That's a sore point with me. And as I said off air, I don't have too much respect for MAGA. I don't really go with a lot of the excuses that I voted for Trump because the price of eggs are too high. I don't care about dictatorships. I don't care about democracy. Putin's not such a bad guy, and on and on and on. It kind of turns my stomach. How would you say, I think I know the answer, but I've got to ask you. You mentioned how the state of education in America is dismal and getting worse. There was a couple of reports just recently about how we are now, I don't know what the number is, down in the reading and math scores somewhere, I don't know, below Uganda or something, where our scores are just keep going down and down. How much would you say that not only the lack of civic education, but just the lack of a functional education system in America contributed to Donald Trump's victory?
Well, one of the worst things we've done in the public policy arena is lower standards and expectations of students. And the latest National Literacy Survey was done just before the pandemic in 2019. It found that the median reading level, half read better, half don't read as well, was fifth grade, 11 years old. And it found that more than 1 in 5 Americans read at the level of an 8-year-old. So I would say they're functionally illiterate. You know, they can read a billboard, see a stop sign, but they have no contextual skills for reading. Similarly, in math, many of the fast food chains now no longer have cash registers that have numbers on them. So you don't input $5.99 for a hamburger. You push the picture of that hamburger, and if somebody wants cheese, you push another button with a slice of cheese on it. This decline in skills is not limited to poor people. It is across the board. The Atlantic magazine just did a piece about students at elite colleges like Harvard and Cornell who don't know how to read a novel. Now, you might say, what do you mean don't know how to read a novel? It's actually a skill to read a novel. It's not a particularly difficult skill to learn, but you have to keep in your mind what you've read unless you're going to sit there and read 100,000 words straight through, which is highly unlikely. And you need to interpret and understand as you go along what you're doing. There's research I was shown by the people at Audible, or told about, that the first time a number, an Arabic numeral appears in a book, a lot of readers drop off. They just never read any further. So my next book, in the first half of it, will not have any numbers. It will have concepts, larger, smaller, double, half, things like that, but no numbers. One of the things that any college professor who has a diverse student body can tell you is that the foreign students who come here, who clearly are overall in the upper tier of students in their home countries, are vastly better prepared than American students. When I taught law and business at Syracuse University to graduate students, I was always struck by how incredibly more sophisticated and critical and filled with critical thinking skills my Chinese students were. Their shortfall was they couldn't think creatively and they couldn't challenge their professor because they were raised in an environment where you are absolutely obedient to your professor. One day I had two young women who had no trouble at all mixing it up with me. And so I asked them to come by my office and I said, what's going on here? And they said, and the first words were very revealing about who these young women were. Well, the party has begun to experiment with Western style education. And I confirmed that their parents were in the party, which is a tiny segment of the Chinese population. And so they, from kindergarten, went to schools where they were encouraged to question and challenge their professors, to think outside the box. And I said to them, and I continue to believe, that if China adopts broadly those reforms, they will just run past the whole rest of the world and leave us behind. We venerate stupidity in this country. I mean, remember when Sarah Palin made her incredibly dumb remarks, ranging from, she can see Russia from her house, to observations about society that just she pulled out of a hat. And we suddenly had Fox News saying, yeah, but she's so hot. And what do we care if she's not that smart? And this is a real problem. And what Trump has done by saying he loves the poorly educated, something he's continued to do for the last 10 years, is he's appealing to people who feel they've been dumped on by society. And they have been. They were shortchanged. They didn't get a decent education. But the solution to that is to properly educate new young people coming along. And then we have Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Journal editorial pages continually telling us that we don't need college, we don't need more education, because if you want to live in a society that's ruled by the rich, an oligarchy or an authoritarian or totalitarian society, you really need to drive down the education level of the populace so that they'll embrace this. And that's what Trump is working on, is get people who will just say, I don't know anything about democracy. I don't understand all this. You just take care of it for me.
Education is really the attack on education is really a pet peeve of me. I'm one of the only people I know that read both the Army Times and the Chronicle of Higher Education. I'm very much a supporter of education in this country. Let me ask you, David. I mean, this isn't a vast right-wing conspiracy against dumbing down America and against education, or is it? Why are we supporting stupidity in this country? As you said, I believe that we are supporting stupidity in this country. Why?
Well, I think this is part of a great social movement. And when great social changes take place, they're like tsunamis. You can't stop them. They have to play out. So when Gutenberg, after he made a mistake cutting a board, when you had to cut the letters for an entire page and then be able to print maybe 100 copies from a pressed board, realized he could create movable type. And suddenly books became widely available and inexpensively available in Europe, combined with the results of the plague, the Black Death that killed about a third of Europeans in the 14th century. There was a change that took place, and it reduced the grip of the church on the minds of people, and we got then the Enlightenment, which led to our Constitution. Well, in this case, there is such rapid change taking place in the world, particularly since World War II, that a lot of people, I don't think, can cope with it. So one of the things you can do about that is to seek refuge in this mythical Ozzie and Harriet white picket fence past in America, which existed for a small group of white people, but it's a myth and not a good myth. So I think that the fundamental driver here is change that's too quick for a lot of people to cope with. Life is always changing. The planet's always changing. But we don't raise people to appreciate that there's change. Principles stay the same, but conditions differ. And then secondly, we have vastly underserved our students because we're not replacing a subsidy we had for education. When I went to school in the 50s and the 60s, there were lots of young women who were planning or hoping to get married, but who taught school until they did, or older women who, after their kids were grown, went back to teaching again. And I had all female teachers until junior high school, and every one of them was either an older married woman or a young single woman. The When women went into the workforce heavily, starting in the late 60s and then especially into the 1970s, we lost this implicit subsidy of being able to pay less because there were limited job opportunities for women. So my wife became the CEO of a very large charitable endowment she built up into $600 million from nothing. But her mother, who was just as well educated and just as smart, was a housewife. And the only thing she could do in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was volunteer work. My mother went to college, but she worked as a clerk. So people didn't hire women for the kinds of jobs she was capable of doing. And once you opened up the job market to women, you opened up the professions to women, what happened is we lost this implicit subsidy that let us hire really good teachers at low wages, and we've never made up for it. If we really wanted a solid education system, we would have higher standards for teachers, and we would start their annual pay at about $100,000 a year. What we're buying are cheap brains, and they're nice, well-motivated people, but they just don't have the level of skill that we need to educate young people for the world of the 21st century.
Oh, I agree with you. And it just seems strange to me that it seems to be, although not entirely, an American phenomenon. As you said, when foreign students come here, by and large, they're much better educated than our American counterparts. And it seems to me, and I've talked about this a lot with my associates and friends, and tell me if you agree with this or not. America, back to its roots, is a pull yourself up by the bootstraps start of a society, and we value hard physical labor over mental labor. We left Europe, where they've had universities for hundreds and hundreds of years. We came here, and it is by the sweat of our brow that we that just seems to be the mindset of Americans. Is there anything to that or not?
Yeah, there's a very important role that is played by the guilds in Europe in American immigration. Many of the people who came here from Europe, and my ancestors from Norway and Scotland and Northern Ireland, they came here in part because they were excluded from the guilds. Guilds were an early form of unions. They limited membership, and as a result, were able to maintain higher wages for the people inside the guilds. In this country, until 1842, unions were treated as criminal organizations. If a bunch of workers got together to ask the boss for a raise, that was a crime in the United States. And this hatred of the guilds or unions by a lot of people is a cultural factor that's been passed down from generation to generation. It has historical roots in Europe. And the union movement has not done a very good job. I've argued two union leaders of selling the public on what went on here. Secondly, there's this myth in America that, teachers, they only work 30 weeks a year and they work 6 hours a day. They have not a clue about what teachers do. All the time they spend on nights and weekends prepping, or studying, etc. And across America, we have cut in schools programs of drama, of arts. Many schools, not a majority by any means, but a significant minority of schools no longer require students to read a novel. I've talked with high school students who were my students in either college, undergraduate or postgraduate courses, as well as in lectures around the country, who they were shown a movie so that if you read To Kill a Mockingbird, your Atticus Finch isn't my Atticus Finch. But if you see the movie, we get a pre-digested, wonderful as it is, Gregory Peck version. And there are school districts, even here in New York State. I live in Western New York, in Rochester, New York. There are school districts within about a 30-minute drive of me who ban To Kill a Mockingbird. Regarded as, in the case of one school district, filth. And so this anti-intellectualism, which Richard Hofstadter wrote about in the 1950s, the long history of that, that absolutely affects our society. And yes, we are way behind everybody else. I mean, I've had students from China, Korea, South Korea, France in my classes, Norway. All of them had a better base education than the best of my American students who went to prep schools or well-known, first-rate high schools. And a lot of this is responding, I believe, to the two-income household. If you have a one-income household, then mom, occasionally dad, but mostly mom, has time to work with kids to sit and watch that they're doing their homework, even if she doesn't know the homework, and she probably does, how to help them. But when you have a two-income households and these increasingly long commute periods, there's less time for children. And that's been a real societal negative. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that you could be a man with 5 kids and 1 paycheck and be a homeowner and not have debt. Me, when I was 23 years old, I had 5 children. I bought a home with my own money, and I had 2 new cars. One was on an 18-month note, and the other a 3-year note, both of which paid off early. That's gone away. Incomes from work, labor incomes, except for the top, have collapsed in terms of what they pay. I talk to experienced journalists now who make in today's money half of what I made when I was a 19-year-old staff writer at the San Jose Mercury. I got hired as a teenager. They came to me. Every job I've ever had, they came to me. I've never applied for a job. And I talked to journalists who were fully experienced, and they're being offered jobs, at essentially about half what I was making. And that's astonishing what's happened. And how did that happen? Well, Americans chose to do that. They elected a president who decided to destroy unions. And the smaller the share of workers in the private sector who belong to unions, the more pressure to push wages down. People shouldn't forget, Donald Trump has said many times, there's lots of videos out there, wages are too high. And people who think, oh, Donald's my savior. I alone can save you. Yes, you save me. Please save me. They don't understand that he wants to either lower wages or promote mechanisms like his tariffs to redistribute money upward to people at the top. So government policy is central to economics. And at the same time, education suffers when you have to have a two-income household, especially in a society where the rules about 40-hour work weeks and things like that are just ignored by employers everywhere.
When you've got a population of about 50% that read at an 8th grade level or less.
No, fifth grade or less.
I'm sorry.
1 in 5 at 3rd grade or less.
I stand corrected. Yeah. Well, since that's the case, it's really kind of hard to follow the economic trends.
Absolutely.
Or to think about really pretty much anything other than perhaps the back of a soup can, and that might be even a little too complicated for some. And I'm angry about this because look. When you and I were younger, you just talked about it a lot. A man could raise a family and buy a house and a car with a high school diploma. Right. Work in a factory.
And either a union or a company that paid union wages to keep the union out.
Exactly. With the dumbing down of America, when I was younger, when you were younger, I think one of the main things that sticks with me to this day, David, is that especially in the 50s and 60s, maybe the 70s, we had a forward-looking view of the world. We were very optimistic for the most part. Right. We didn't think about destruction and how evil our country is and how we hate institutions and all of that. Whereas it's been reversed now. People, as you've read the studies as much as I had, probably more, where the majority of Americans believe we're going in the wrong direction. They don't look forward to the future. They believe their children will have it worse than they did. This goes hand in hand, in my opinion, with the dumbing down of America and the fact that they can't keep up. You're right. They are being left behind, whether that is the fault of our educational system. But if you are looking backward at a time that really never really existed for the most part, then you're going to hate the institutions now. You're going to hate modernity. You're going to hate things like computer science and robotics and the greening of America, or space exploration, for God's sake. Why would we want to go to space when we haven't solved all the problems of this world? To me, it's all part of the same thing, and it's exactly what Trump is preaching and why he's so popular. People are afraid; they want to go back to the Leave It to Beaver days, and they're not educated enough to realize that that never existed, and it's stupidity. It's going to doom our culture.
Well, and part of this story is that Donald, whom I've known and covered since 1988. In fact, I wrote in 1988 about the prospect of his becoming president someday. Donald is appallingly ignorant. When he made his trip to Japan in 2017, they stopped off in Hawaii because he wanted to go see the Trump hotel that has his name on it. He also was taken to the USS Arizona Memorial, and his chief of staff, retired General Kelly, had to explain to him why there is a memorial there. I mean, how you can grow up in America and not know that December 7, 1941 is a date that will live in infamy is amazing. But Donald literally doesn't know anything. He claims to be the world's greatest expert on 22 subjects. I've documented these claims. And he claims that he is the greatest expert in the history of the world on taxes. Now, I'm a noted authority on taxes. I've written best-selling books. I used to be a columnist for Tax Notes magazine, which is read by all serious people in tax world. And I was the New York Times tax reporter for 13 years, where I won a Pulizer Prize and was a finalist 3 other times. Donald was asked under oath one day in a lawsuit, "So, Mr. Trump, what do you know about accounting?" "I don't know anything about accounting." "You don't know anything about accounting?" And for maybe 5 or 6 pages of the transcript, they tie him down on this to make sure there's no wiggle room. He knows nothing of accounting. I had to learn accounting in order to cover taxes for the New York Times. I learned it well enough that for 8 years I had a joint appointment at the Graduate Business School at Syracuse, which is really an accounting school, teaching accounting students. I wasn't teaching them the technical aspects of it. I was teaching them principle and theory. But how can someone who knows nothing of accounting, which is central to tax, possibly be an expert, not to mention the greatest expert of all time? But people don't know this. People who watched his show, The Apprentice and The Celebrity Apprentice, don't know what goes on in corporate executive suites. To anybody who does, the show was just laughable. It was hilariously awful. But why would someone who works with their hands or works as a clerk have any idea of what goes on in executive offices? They wouldn't. So Donald simply pulled the wool over these people's eyes. And the Democrats did a very poor job, as they always do, of messaging, of pushing back against him. They talked too much in policy language, wonky language, whereas Donald would say, "We love you." Donald doesn't love anybody. He doesn't love himself, but it is an appealing remark to audiences. Now, the dumbing down of the country is, I think, part of this much bigger social trend where we stopped investing in the middle class. In fact, we began draining money from them. There's a study by RAND, which was originally set up about 70 years ago as a think tank for the U.S. Air Force. There's a study by RAND that shows that because of government policies, $50 trillion was taken from the middle class and lower classes and redistributed to the very, very top. In fact, a smaller group than 1%. And this redistribution upward through government policies, which I wrote a trilogy of best-selling books, popular best-selling books about, perfectly legal, on taxes, free lunch, on stealth hidden subsidies to big corporations that I took years digging out of the record, and then the fine print about suppressing competition. Because if there's anything business people don't want, it's competition. If you can get 3 companies running an industry, have 90% of an industry spread among 3 companies, you do better than if you were a monopoly, a single company with 90%. And while they were bestsellers, in a country of 300 million people, selling for the 3 of them 1 million books is nothing. It had one big beneficial effect. Everybody came to realize in this country that corporations were using your tax dollars instead of their own money to do a lot of their expansions, building factories and warehouses and stuff. But beyond that, it didn't have an effect because not enough people got the message or care. That doesn't make them stupid. Walk into a blue-collar bar when on the TV some controversial call is made by the referee or the umpire, and you will see a debate by people who really know the game and the rules. It's that they're disconnected from politics. They've been made to feel that they don't have a voice, they don't matter. A complete reversal of the 1960s empowerment movement that tried to persuade people, yes, you have power. We can't change any of this till we change a culture. And the cultural change has to begin with, it's not okay to be ignorant. Stupid won't get you anywhere, but ignorant, not knowing. It's not okay. You need to know. And if you don't know, it's a terrible thing that was done to you. Get your children a better life. Be demanding of your children to get a better education. Working against that is our extreme poverty. And I was, as my critics like to point out, I was the person who put inequality on the map in America. When I was at the New York Times, I would write these stories multiple times a year, documenting from government data the widening gap going on in our country. The Times got lots of letters complaining and criticizing about my work, which was all carefully rooted in data and which no one has ever shown had an error, by the way, nobody. And as this split began to occur, you have a larger and larger share of people who say, well, there's no point. I'm always going to be poor, or I'm never going to get ahead. And that affects their outcome, as opposed to poor parents 100 years ago who said, my children are going to study because they're going to live a better life than I did. And so there are these large social forces at work. That's what we need to pay attention to more than the little items here and there. And let me give you a little killer fact that I find very troubling. I live 5 blocks outside of Rochester, New York, the home to Kodak, Xerox, Bausch and Lomb, where Western Union Telegraph got started. For 100 years up until 1975, Rochester was the industrial era equivalent of Silicon Valley, Seattle, and the Route 128 corridor in Massachusetts all rolled into one. This was Innovation Center. The city was so rich that in 1967, Businessweek did a cover story about the richest city in America. Well, today, Rochester is one of the very poorest cities in America, and more than 1 in 10 Rochester schools children are homeless. More than 1 in 10. But it's more than 2,000 kids. And how do they get by? Well, they couch surf. They stay with various people. Occasionally, people end up sleeping on the streets, but they're homeless. And that didn't occur in our past. So we need to, address the underlying changes that have been made. The house that I bought when I was with my own money, when I was 22 years old as a reporter at the San Jose Mercury, I paid 2.5 years income for that house. Today, I couldn't buy that house. It's worth $3 million. And it's a nothing house. It's a little tract house with a concrete slab and 3 bedrooms in a tract in Sunnyvale, California. But it's worth $3 million. We've distorted our economics all over the place. And imagine if Walmart ran on the theory of the real estate industry, higher prices every day. So we've really messed up our economics. As a result, we've messed up our cultural values. We have tried to shortchange things. Many of our state universities and colleges used to be tuition-free or virtually tuition-free to students. And if you didn't perform, they threw you out. They didn't have any hesitation. Even during the Vietnam War, they'd throw you out if you didn't perform. Well, many states now have so severely cut aid to the state universities and colleges that they get maybe 6% of their money in some cases from the state government. By the way, where did the money go? Well, tax cuts for the highest income residents and businesses in the state. We're not investing in young people.
David, there's just so much to unpack here. I've got to get to a couple of points that I think are crucial. And the growing inequality, which is basically what you're talking about and getting to, is one of the most important issues here. And my question right now for you is, since there is this huge inequality, this huge income gap, why do so many in MAGA, or all the people, I guess, that voted for Trump, support oligarchs? Why do they support multi-billionaires, sometimes close to trillionaires, who are doing to them exactly what you're talking about? Why, even if you're dumb, why would you support somebody who's so filthy rich that you should know intrinsically doesn't give a damn about you? I don't get that. Maybe you can explain it to me.
Yeah, there are plenty of billionaires who are deeply concerned about our society and care. You can't be black and white about it. But
no, right.
They have a lot of money. They must know what they're doing, is the thought process. I don't have any money. I guess I don't know what I'm doing. They have a lot of money. They know what they're doing. That was part of the argument the banking industry made about getting itself deregulated, which led to the collapse in 2008. You know, we don't need to have all these rules about underwriting mortgages because we know what we're doing. And the Bush administration bought into that. So, Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, a book still in print, he was the first to figure out market economics. He's the father of modern economics. But he wrote another book 20 years earlier called The Theory of Our Moral Sentiments. And in that book, he argued that, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here, that it's the nature and disposition of most people that they look up to and perhaps even worship the rich, while despising those of mean condition, which meant the poor. And that's a core issue here. If we venerate people who are rich just for being rich and despise people who are poor, we're missing the story. Martin Luther King said he wanted his 4 children to grow up in a world where they would be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. We have created a society in which we judge people by the content of their wallet, or in Donald Trump's case, the imaginary contents of his wallet.
Well, how can MAGA on one hand say they hate elites and yet venerate Trump and his fellow oligarchs? I don't get that point.
It's not logical. This is not a logical reaction. This is an emotional reaction. Now, the Chicago school, I went to the Chicago School for Graduate Economics, the University of Chicago. They reduced everything to algebra. When I went there, I was absolutely blown away by these mathematical formulas that explained everything. And then one day I was in a discussion with fellow students in a PhD seminar about a young man who pulled up outside the window on one of the first warm days of spring, and there's lots of young women walking by in short skirts, and he's rum with the engine on his big new Trans Am Pontiac. And we got into a discussion about, in my view, how dumb that was. He's in debt for this car, and what kind of dumb, do you really want to be around a girl who thinks that's impressive to go rum? Go buy yourself a Volkswagen and meet some woman who put a smile on your face when you're 80 years old. And they explained to me that I had it completely wrong. This was purely rational economic behavior. And no, it wasn't. It was gonads. It was being driven by something that's not rational. And when I said to one of them, hey, look, I just turned 24 years old and I have 5 children. That's not an economically rational decision. They went, oh, no, it is. It is. Because you see, you have a preference for children. So they could explain away anything. And that thinking from the Chicago school up until about 25 years ago totally dominated American economic policy. It's been eroded now as almost an army of behavioral economists have shown it's wrong. The Chicago school people were wrong. Human beings make irrational choices all the time. Well, MAGA is a reflection of irrational choices. And at the core, MAGA is really about, I want to make America white again. I want Black people and minorities and lesbians and others to, know their place and stay in it. And Donald Trump's given permission to this. He's taken the veneer of civility on civil rights that we had developed since the 50s. He just ripped it off and encouraged the ugliest behavior by a lot of people.
I was just going to ask you about that. You read my mind. I understand on an intellectual level of how people can be enraged and really angry about being left behind, or at least feeling that they've been left behind. I get it, but explain this to me if you can, David. Where does all of the cruelty come from? Why have we become so uncivil to each other, more so than in any time in my lifetime? Where has that come from?
Well, that's always been there. Remember, we had lynching,
Sure.
we had slavery. Every state, every one of the colonies had slavery at some point. And we protected slaves who escaped to places like Minnesota that didn't have slavery and pushed them back. So the cruelty has always been there. I think it's an element in the human condition.
Sure.
That we have to deal with. But what Donald's done is given permission to people to do this. Not everybody, but on the margins, it's been very effective. And this anger has an outlet that he approves of, which is going after, killing people you don't like, attacking people, mistreating them. And that's all rooted in this notion that people who aren't white are somehow inferior. Remember, people who were Black in America were literally not human beings under the law. They didn't even have the status of a dog. And so we have a history to deal with there. Secondly, to leaders like Donald, it's beneficial. If Donald can provoke some kind of violent reaction, he can suspend the Constitution, which he talked about doing in his first administration. At a minimum, he can suspend habeas corpus, that is the right to be brought before a judge if you're arrested. Lincoln did that in the Civil War. What's important to know about that, by the way, is that habeas corpus is not a right. It says right in the Constitution, the privilege of habeas corpus shall not be suspended except in times of war and insurrection. Donald would be delighted to be able to lock up people he doesn't like Liz Cheney, and deny him a day in court.
David, do you believe that, talking about that specific point, do you believe that when he is inaugurated in not quite, in about 2 weeks, that he is going to, either through his crazy mass deportation actions, through putting the military on the streets or some other similar actions, do you believe he's going to incite a condition or conditions where he will be able to suspend habeas corpus and do exactly what you say? What do you think that the chances for that are, realistically?
Well, I won't be surprised one bit if he does it. And so far, my batting average on predictions about Donald is holding steady at 1,000. And in baseball, if you hit 250, you're a star. So doesn't mean he will do it, just like it doesn't mean he'll abandon Ukraine. Donald is very mercurial. He has no underlying principles or knowledge to guide him, and he's very subject to whoever is flattering him at the moment. But there are other forces at work that could lead to various protests and demonstrations. Remember, Donald believes that students should be arrested if they protest. Student protest goes all the way back to the universities in Europe that you mentioned. He has said repeatedly that journalists like me, and he has said he hates me more than any other journalist in the world, more than once he said that.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Journalists, he says, journalists shouldn't be allowed to write things about me that I don't approve of. How Stalinistic, how dictatorial can you get beyond that? So Donald is going to do whatever he thinks will further his interests in the moment. He doesn't think long-term and strategically. I think there's a very high risk that we will see the military used against American citizens. He has said he intends to reactivate General Mark Milley, who was head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff when he was president. If you're a U.S. military officer, you're subject to recall to the age of 70, and Milley's in his 60s. The problem he'll have there is that he needs to get a board of generals to convict Mark Milley. And I can't imagine that will happen. The thing I would worry about most, and this would be the biggest warning that something is about to happen, is if Trump starts firing generals and admirals and promoting out of order junior officers. There are always majors and colonels, lieutenant colonels, who will sell out their country for their own vaingloriousness. We do an incredibly great job in the U.S. military of weeding out people and promoting based on skill and talent and accomplishment. I've met many general officers of the United States military, and I've walked away from more than a few going, what a jerk. But I've never, ever walked away from one going, how did that idiot get above lieutenant? We do a very good job. We probably don't promote everybody we should, and we probably promote some people we shouldn't, but overall, very excellent system to promote people. Trump, in order to become a dictator, will have to, at some point, take control of the military through appointments. And that should be the number one thing we look for, along with, the promises by Kash Patel that he's going to remove the U.S. counterintelligence function of the FBI and move it somewhere else. I mean, gee, that must make terrorists out there very happy. And prosecute people under Pam Bondi as Attorney General because he doesn't like them. And you're going to see lots of harassment of news organizations and individual journalists, tax audits, regulatory audits, lawsuits designed to use up their resources fighting the government. And unfortunately, a large segment of the public is going to cheer that.
I agree with you. And the biggest fear I have, and millions have, is not just that Trump is saying he'll do this, because as you said, he changes with the wind. It's the people he's surrounding himself with, many of which you've just mentioned. He didn't have that before. He's going to have it now. He's got a cast of clowns and idiots, many of which are going to get confirmed. That's the way it's going with MAGA. That's my greatest fear. He may say, go do this, and the next moment he doesn't even remember he said it, but the AG and the CIA or the FBI director is going to carry that out. And that, to me, is the most frightening thing. That's what I do believe is going to happen.
Yeah, one of the myths about Donald is that he's this great executive. Within days of meeting Donald Trump, I came to realize that he was utterly incompetent. And the people who first told me this were his own executives in the casino industry in Atlantic City. I left the LA Times and went to the Philadelphia Inquirer to run the Atlantic City Bureau because I thought in 1988 gambling was about to spread across the country, and I wanted to document that, and that's indeed exactly what happened. And then state regulators who, in very polite language, would say, Donald is not an operator. And I very quickly learned he was damaging the businesses, not building them up. He was interfering. He had an opportunity to win $24 million from a man who gambled in his casino at the rate of, hold on to your hat, $70 million an hour.
Wow.
And Donald should have won $24 million from him, but he interfered in the game, and so he lost $6 million. Well, and he lost actually 12 because he had a $6 million note he never collected. So he lost 12 million. He was utterly incompetent at his businesses. And look at all the strings of failures and stupid ideas of businesses, that just failed. And one of the things people don't know is he never had any money in any of his businesses. He never had a dollar in Atlantic City. It was all borrowed money for which he took fees off the top. So Donald is a terrible manager. When he came in 2017, he had not expected to win. That's very clear. He didn't think he was going to win. He had nobody in place. He had no team, and he fired Chris Christie, whose job was to get people who were competent to be appointed. So we got this clown car cabinet. This time around, here's Project 2025. He blessed Project 2025 at its start. There's a video of him doing that. Then during the campaign, he went, I don't know what it is. I have no idea. And then he would say on another day, there are parts of it I like and parts of it I don't like. Well, I'm sorry, which is it? You either know what's in it or you don't. He's now implementing Project 2025. He has a dedicated core of ideologues, some of whom are very talented managers. And that's what being president or head of a cabinet agency is. You're a manager. And so his lack of management skill will be made up for by these people. It will turn out to be, I think, critically important to how successful Donald is in his aim to be our first dictator. He is reined in by his chief of staff, a woman named Willies, who is a longtime Republican operative. She apparently is a very talented manager, and to the extent that she can, channel him and hold back his worst impulses in terms of working against his agenda, he'll be effective at what he wants to get.
I have absolutely no faith in her because she's MAGA through and through, and I don't think
but
she's
she's
going to.
she's competent, David.
I believe you're right.
You're right.
Yes,
yes, yes. Competent.
I agree.
And so just as General Kelly saved Donald Trump from a lot of things that would have been very damaging to him and saved the country from some damaging things, I think she's going to turn out to be critically important. Donald is very mercurial. He behaves in strange ways. And don't be surprised if something happens 2 years out that prompts the cabinet, many of whom came from not Donald Trump's loyal groups, but people loyal to Peter Thiel, I hate all the news, period, billionaire, and J.D. Vance. If they wait till January 21st of 2027 to act, to remove Trump and make J.D. Vance president, he can serve 10 years. You can serve 2 years plus less than half of a term where you took over. And it may not happen, but don't be one bit surprised if it does, because Donald is useful to the people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and the other billionaires who are right-wing billionaires who are funding him, so long as he's useful to them. And once he becomes an impediment to their desire to create a society where they rule, then that will disappear very rapidly. It's in the same vein. It was very revealing, I thought, when the Saturday Night Live newscast started out a couple of weeks ago. The comedy news and Colin Jost put up pictures of 3 of Trump appointees and said, Donald Trump announced yesterday the people he'll fire in 6 months.
Well, where do you see a J.D. Vance presidency going then, if that comes to pass in 2 years?
Well, like Donald, J.D. Vance doesn't have any principles. I mean, that's one of the unique features of people around him. Lindsey Graham, it's very clear. There's no principles in Lindsey Graham, a former military officer. So J.D. Vance clearly, responds to whatever father figure is important in his life, especially if daddy is a sugar daddy. And his views are terrible for you if you're not rich and white. So were he to get into the White House, I think you'd see a further movement in this way. Now, the answer to these things is people have to turn out to vote. And the Democrats, to get people to turn out to vote, have to recognize that, and this is something I said to Nancy Pelosi's face a number of years ago, that you're the party of working people. You need to behave like that. She was standing there in a $4,000 dress with Louboutins, which are those $1,000 plus high heels with the red soles. And that is not an argument against money. I'm a poster boy for growing up poor and becoming prosperous. It is an argument that Democrats need to speak for working class families.
Let me ask you one last question, David, because I know you have to run, and we'll end it with this. You just mentioned how, I don't know if you said it at the beginning of the interview, I think you said something like 13 million voters sat out the last election. Do you believe that if things go as we both feel they might over the next 2 years with the Trump presidency, that some, most, all, or none of those people are going to continue to sit it out? Or are they going to be so disaffected, so outraged? What do you predict is going to happen to those 13 million after 2 years of a Trump presidency?
So 13 million from 2020 who didn't vote, and then population growth, 17 million people. We should have had 17 million more votes cast. We will see people come back to voting to the level of 2020 if Donald Trump acts in ways that are contrary to their interests, and they understand that. And that's the job of the Democrats, to make that clear. Donald Trump's policies are bad for you. Let me just give you one really good example. I wrote about this for the New Republic. The article's free. You can look up my name in quotes, David Cay Johnston and the New Republic, and tariffs. But let's assume Trump imposes, as he says, a 60% tariff on all imported Chinese goods. And you own David Dubato Motors. You make cars here in America. And you sell your cars for the same price as the Chinese, $10,000. You make a $1,000 profit on each car. Now the Chinese cars are going to be $16,000. Who's going to buy them? Well, you're not going to keep selling cars at $10,000. You'd be an idiot to do that. You're going to raise your price to make the math simple, $15,000. Now you're going to make a $6,000 profit on every car. Of course, you're going to sell fewer cars because the price is higher. So you sell half as many cars. You just tripled your profits. So this is a scheme, this tariff scheme, to raise the prices of domestically made goods, which is in turn a scheme to siphon money out of the pockets of consumers and put it in the pockets of the ownership class, which is a very narrow segment of American society. I have seen only one passing mention of this in all the national news I track every day. Because the journalists covering this stuff, they just know, oh, I look quickly, here's what a tariff is. Okay, I got it. They're generalists. They're not specialists. But even some of the specialist economics people, they keep forgetting that the purpose of a tariff is to raise prices so domestic manufacturers can make bigger profits to build up muscle. If you're a developing country, and China is still a developing country, you want tariffs to bring up prices. That's what we did in the early days of the Republic. We didn't want people buying stoves made in England. We wanted domestic stoves. So we put tariffs on to help the domestic stove industry get more profits to reinvest in building the business for the future.
But is that going to be enough, David? I mean, one of the truest things that Trump ever said was that I could shoot somebody or murder somebody on Fifth Avenue and my public would still love me. He was right about that. So if he raises the tariffs, like you said, and it's going to raise our prices, yes, economics count. But is that going to be enough?
It will be enough if the Democrats understand how to exploit this, how to tell people, the reason eggs cost even more than they did is because of Donald. The reason a new car suddenly costs $10,000 more is because of Donald. And they have to make that as a persuasive case. They have to organize, and they've got to focus on core economic issues. The great political scientist V.O. Key, in the book published in 1962, right after he died, showed that Americans vote their pocketbooks. And if Donald produces a cornucopia economy where the working class prospers, then his party's going to benefit. But nothing in his economic plan says that will happen. His economic plan says that it's going to be worse for people in the bottom half.
Oh, but I believe it's going to be a disaster for the American people, for farmers, for business people. I mean, for all of them. And I think it was James Carville during the Clinton administration or campaigns that said it's the economy, stupid, and it's never changed. He was right then. It's right now. So you're right. The Democrats have to get that message across. Will they? Who knows? The
Democrats also have to exploit the wedges within the Republican Party. So there are lots of Republicans who want to throw everybody who is here without permission or with limited permission out of the country. Well, I don't know who's going to tend crops and pick the crops and who's going to work in the slaughterhouses. And there are towns in the Midwest and the South that will just die if we do that. They'll just economically die. So there will be pushback from Republicans in those areas. And so in deportation, probably a lot more show than substance. But Donald's policies need to be allowed to run out, get out there. And then the Democrats need to come up with strategies that aren't based in policy. I teach public policy, don't do that. Reach people the way Donald does at a visceral level. Hey, you want to know why your wallet's thinner? Donald Trump. Don't get complicated about it. Donald's tariff.
Do you believe that they should then just concentrate on the economy and get off of the dictatorship, the authoritarianism, and all the other messages? Do you think that that's a dead issue?
No, I don't think it's a dead issue, but I think it's one that you don't pull out as your lead punch. You use it as a way to back up things. Hey, look, he's taking away your liberties. He's taking away your freedoms. the Democrats are not dead by any means. I mean, remember, Donald won by one of the narrowest margins of any presidential election, 1.5 percentage points. He didn't get half the vote. He has less than half the vote. He does not have a mandate. LBJ in 1964 had a mandate. Ronald Reagan in 1984 had a mandate. Not at all true of Donald Trump, even though he keeps saying that. And he's going to keep saying that. So don't play Donald's game. That's the deepest fundamental message is don't play Donald's game and don't voluntarily surrender the way ABC News did in a case they would have won, but instead they're paying $16 million to a Donald charity and his lawyers for something that was accurate and correct. Because why? Well, Donald could do a lot of things to the Disney company as president, and they were hoping that will shield him. And you know what? That's not how it works. Bowing down to a dictator doesn't get him to pass you over and pat you on the back.
That makes my blood boil when you think about that. We can do an entire segment on just the media and their whole stake in this election, and after the election, going down to kiss the ring and bended knee. But we don't have time for that. David, I know you've got to run. David, thank you very much. David Cay Johnston, Pulitzer Prize winning author and journalist, currently a professor at Rochester Institute of Technology. Thank you so much for joining us today on the No Delusion Zone. Take care, stay safe, stay sane, and let's try to do this again in the future.
Thank you, David. Take care.
Take care.